April 1945. Somewhere along a muddy roadside in the collapsing heart of Germany, a narrow column of prisoners trudges past, burnt-out farmhouses, and the distant rumble of artillery. Among them walks a young German woman once, a signals auxiliary, now exhausted, silent, and unsure whether the next hour will bring safety or death. Her uniform jacket hangs loose on her shoulders, her hands trembling from cold and fear as American trucks grind to a halt beside the group. A soldier gestures for her to climb aboard. She hesitates, remembering every warning drilled into her since childhood. The enemy shows no mercy. But the alternative is staying on the road, surrounded by chaos. She takes a step up, metal scraping beneath her boots, and the canvas flap falls shut behind her. Inside the truck, the scent of diesel mixes with something unfamiliar warm food. A small tin bowl sits on the bench, steam rising into the dim light. No one speaks. Disbelief lingers in every pair of eyes. She doesn't know it yet, but this moment will overturn everything she thought she understood about war, captivity, and the people she was taught to fear. And the story of how she reached this point begins long before this quiet, astonishing scene. To understand why a single act of kindness could astonish a German POW woman in 1945, we have to return to the world that shaped her expectations long before she stepped into that American truck. Europe was sinking into its sixth year of war, and Germany, once confident, once triumphant, was unraveling under the weight of a conflict it could no longer sustain. By early 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing from both sides, the Red Army closing from the east with unstoppable force, and the Western Allies advancing through the Rhine after months of grinding progress. Inside Germany, chaos replaced order. Cities lay in ruins, transportation networks fractured, and food supplies dwindled to desperate levels. Civilians and auxiliary personnel, including thousands of women serving in communications, anti-aircraft support, logistics, and medical roles, found themselves increasingly close to the front. Many of these women had been raised under a rigid propaganda system that portrayed Americans as ruthless, immoral, and eager to inflict suffering on any German they captured. The image was clear. Surrender meant humiliation, starvation, and possibly death. This environment shaped the woman at the center of our story. She grew up with the Hitler Youth's doctrines, radio broadcasts declaring Allied atrocities, and community meetings insisting that defeat would bring the annihilation of German people. When she volunteered or was conscripted into a support role helping the Wehrmacht track communications, she believed she was defending her homeland from an enemy capable of unimaginable cruelty. Yet those beliefs existed in sharp contrast with reality. By the time American troops swept across Western Germany in March and April 1945, their primary objective was to bring the war to a decisive close. That focus meant capturing soldiers, male and female, efficiently, processing them quickly, and moving them into temporary holding camps or permanent POW facilities. For U.S. forces, adherence to the Geneva Convention was not merely a legal obligation, it was a matter of military discipline and international reputation. American command wanted the world to see a stark difference between Axis brutality and Allied conduct, but the average German woman had no way of knowing that. All she had seen were the consequences of total war: bombed cities, families torn apart, and a society steeped in fear. She had heard stories, repeated in whispered conversations, of what might happen if Americans took prisoners, stories often inflated by desperation, but believed nonetheless. So when the front line approached her unit's position and the decision came, fight, flee, or surrender, she faced a choice she never imagined making. The Wehrmacht was disintegrating. Many officers had already abandoned their posts. Resistance meant pointless sacrifice. Escape was impossible, and so she surrendered alongside others, first to a small American reconnaissance group, then to a military police detachment tasked with collecting prisoners and transporting them to a processing site. The march to the roadside where our opening scene unfolded was only the beginning. America's POW system was vast, stretching from makeshift field cages to fully established camps capable of holding tens of thousands of prisoners. Unlike the chaos-consuming Germany, U.S. supply lines remained steady. Despite rationing at home, American forces were still fed, clothed, and equipped at levels unmatched by any army in the world. What the prisoners would receive: food, medical care, shelter, reflected that logistical strength. But she could not know that. For her, each step toward the waiting trucks tightened the knot in her stomach. Every rumor, every frightening image planted by propaganda, resurfaced. She expected harsh treatment, perhaps worse. She prepared herself for the worst kind of captivity. Yet among the Americans, the atmosphere was strikingly different. Soldiers were tired, determined, and focused on their duties. Many felt no personal hatred toward the prisoners before them. Most were young, unfamiliar with Europe's deeper political wounds, and simply wanted to do their jobs and go home. Women POWs, especially those who were auxiliaries rather than combatants, often drew a more restrained reaction. American troops were instructed to treat them according to military law, without exception. And so, instead of hostility, she encountered order. Instead of violence, she encountered procedure. The transformation from enemy to prisoner began with quiet moments. The gesture toward the truck, the absence of shouting, the presence of warm food. But the true turning point, the moment she would not believe what Americans gave her, was still ahead. Before we reach that scene, we must understand how the POW system worked, and why the United States treated prisoners in ways that astonished people who had only known the brutality of war. That broader foundation begins with how America processed new captives and what they expected from the thousands arriving daily as Germany crumbled. The journey from the roadside to the American POW camp marked the beginning of a process unlike anything most German prisoners expected. For decades, wartime accounts from diaries to interviews would reveal a common theme: profound disbelief at how systematically, and often humanely, the United States handled the influx of captives in the final months of the war. When the woman in our story arrived at the temporary processing site, she joined hundreds of others, moving through a series of controlled steps designed to transform disorganized groups of prisoners into registered individuals protected by international law. The first of these steps was identification. Soldiers collected names, units, roles, and crucially in her case, verified that female POWs were separated from male combatants. The U.S. military recognized that mixed detention could lead to violence, exploitation, or chaos. So women were handled with specific protocols, often processed by units with training in managing civilian or auxiliary groups. Next came delousing, a procedure that felt humiliating but was harshly necessary. Lice, fleas, and disease had spread widely across war-torn Germany. American medical corpsmen, aware of how easily typhus could decimate a camp, insisted on thorough cleansing. Clothing was disinfected or replaced. POWs received soap, another surprise for many, given how scarce it had become in the Reich's final months. For the woman who had grown accustomed to rationed water, cold barracks, and declining hygiene standards, the sudden insistence on medical sanitation was both jarring and strangely reassuring. She watched American medics inspect prisoners for wounds, infections, malnutrition, or frostbite. She expected indifference. Instead, she saw methodical care. Many prisoners later recalled this moment as the first real shift in their understanding of what captivity under the Americans would be like. Then came food. American rations varied, but even the basic meals given to POWs far exceeded what many German civilians were receiving at home. White bread, soft, fresh, and almost foreign to those accustomed to coarse wartime loaves, frequently appeared. Soups, thick with vegetables, potatoes, or beans were common. For some prisoners, it was the first full meal in days. For others, it was the first nutritious meal in months. The woman in our story ate cautiously at first, half expecting a trick, half convinced her stomach wouldn't tolerate the sudden richness. These early moments planted the seeds of disbelief, but the deeper surprise came from the environment inside the American camps. Unlike the brutal prison networks established by Nazi Germany, U.S. POW installations operated under oversight from the Red Cross, military inspectors, and sometimes journalists. Camps were fenced, guarded, and controlled, but they were not designed to break prisoners psychologically. They were designed to maintain order and uphold the Geneva Convention. Work assignments existed, but they were regulated. Punishments existed, but they had to be documented. Harassment or abuse of POWs could lead to disciplinary action against American personnel. For a woman raised under the specter of an all-powerful state that disregarded such constraints, the structure itself felt surreal. Inside the camp, she received a bunk in a heated barrack. She was given a blanket clean, heavier than expected, and clearly American-made. She was issued utensils, a cup, and sometimes even small comforts like writing materials. These items, mundane to the U.S. Army, were almost luxurious in late-war Germany. Yet the most astonishing aspect was the atmosphere. There were rules, there were guards, but there was also calm. The guards often appeared indifferent, not cruel. They performed their duties with routine efficiency, sometimes offering brief nods or neutral greetings. The absence of hostility was itself disorienting. She had been told to expect hatred. She found bureaucracy instead. Over time, she began to observe the larger system at work. Prisoners were organized into work details, not as punishment, but as a way to keep camps functioning. They maintained hygiene, cooked meals, and helped manage supplies. In many American camps, work meant earning small credits or improving living conditions, an idea almost unimaginable under German military discipline. She also learned that POW mail delivery continued. Letters could be written and received. Families could be contacted. The war was collapsing outside the fences, yet inside them existed an island of stability built by an army determined to maintain order even in the final months of global conflict. The stark contrast between expectation and reality grew sharper each day. This foundation, shaped by careful processing, unexpected comforts, and an entirely different moral framework, set the stage for the moment she would never forget. The moment she received something that made her question everything she thought she knew about her captors. That moment becomes clearer when we look at this story from multiple angles. Her disbelief did not emerge from a single moment alone. It grew from a constellation of experiences, emotional, tactical, logistical, that reframed the meaning of captivity. To understand the magnitude of what she felt, we must examine these experiences through several angles, each revealing a different layer of truth. For the German POW woman, the emotional transformation inside the American camp unfolded slowly, almost unwillingly. Fear did not evaporate overnight. It receded in cautious steps. At first, she avoided eye contact with the guards, expecting sudden anger. She kept her thoughts to herself, convinced that any misstep could bring punishment. Yet day after day, nothing happened. No shouting, no threats, no humiliation. The moment she received her first letter form permission to write home left her shaken. Communication with family had become a luxury in the war's final months. Cities were destroyed, postal routes severed, and many had no idea if loved ones were alive. But here, in captivity, she was invited to reach across the ruins of Germany and try to reconnect. The shock came not from the paper itself, but from the implication. The enemy cares to notify my family that I am alive. Around her, the same disbelief echoed. Women wept quietly as they filled out forms. Some struggled to write. Months of fear had stiffened their hands. Others hesitated, unsure whether their words would ever reach home. Yet this simple act, ordinary in peacetime, became one of the first emotional lifelines the Americans extended. It began to erode the image of a merciless invader and replace it with something more complex, something far harder to reconcile with the propaganda she had grown up believing. This human shift laid the foundation for everything that followed. The United States' treatment of POWs was not solely a matter of compassion. It was also a calculated decision rooted in military doctrine and global strategy. American leaders understood that how they handled German prisoners would shape international opinion. Every action inside those camps served as evidence that the U.S. followed the Geneva Convention to reinforce legitimacy, to contrast sharply with Axis brutality, and to avoid retaliation against American POWs still held in Europe. Treating prisoners well was also practical. A calm, orderly camp was easier to manage than a desperate one. Providing regular food reduced the risk of riots. Ensuring humane treatment lowered the likelihood of escape attempts. And crucially, maintaining a clean and medically stable environment prevented outbreaks that could threaten American personnel. There was also a long-term purpose: reshaping Germany's future. American policymakers understood that one day these prisoners would return home. Their stories would influence how post-war Germans perceived the United States. Acts of fairness, restraint, and consistency were not accidents, they were building blocks in a broader vision of stabilizing Europe after the war. For the German woman, these hidden motives were impossible to see at first, but she could feel their consequences. Everything around her, every procedure, every routine worked with quiet efficiency. There was no improvisation, no vindictive behavior, no signs of chaos. She was not respected as a combatant. She was respected as a human being protected under international law. That distinction mattered deeply in a world collapsing outside the camp fences. Only later would she grasp that this discipline was not personal kindness, but a policy one that reshaped her understanding of war as much as her understanding of the enemy. If the United States had one overwhelming wartime advantage, it was logistics. American supply chains were the envy of the world. Food, fuel, medicine, and equipment flowed steadily across the Atlantic, through ports, and into forward units. This abundance did not vanish at the POW camp gates. For the German woman, the evidence appeared in the smallest details. Bread soft, white, and plentiful arrived daily. The camp kitchens served meals with ingredients she had not seen since early in the war. Canned fruit, powdered eggs, coffee substitutes, beans, and rice appeared with regularity. Even when rations tightened, the U.S. maintained standards far above what Germany could offer its own population by 1945. Hygiene was another revelation. The Americans had industrial-grade delousing equipment, disinfectants, medical kits, and field hospitals capable of treating infections quickly. Many POWs received medical attention they had been denied during their service. The woman, like thousands of others, underwent examinations that revealed issues she had ignored for months: malnutrition, untreated wounds, early infections, dental problems. Some were addressed immediately. Infrastructure also impressed her. Barracks built with insulation, organized water distribution, working latrines, and sufficient bedding. Even the utensils, sturdy metal forks and cups, were better than what many German units possessed in their final months. To her, these resources felt surreal. To the Americans, they were standard. This logistical strength created an environment in which kindness was not merely possible, it was sustainable, and it laid the groundwork for the moment she would never forget, the moment when the Americans gave her something so unexpected that it shook her to her core. A moment that becomes clearer when we explore the remaining angles. We have examined the human, tactical, and logistical forces shaping the German woman's experience. But to fully understand why she reacted with such disbelief to a single gift from the Americans, we must explore the deeper cultural, psychological, and moral dimensions that framed her world. These final angles reveal how captivity became something far more complex than mere confinement. The German woman entered captivity carrying not just fear, but an entire worldview built over years of conditioning. Her upbringing had been marked by order, hierarchy, and national instruction that cast enemies, especially Americans, as decadent, chaotic, and morally corrupt. Yet inside the U.S. camp, she encountered a culture that defied nearly every expectation. American guards joked among themselves, spoke casually, and displayed a level of informality unimaginable within German military structure. They addressed prisoners with a tone that hovered somewhere between strict authority and everyday professionalism. Their posture lacked the ideological rigidity she had grown accustomed to. They did not bark orders for theatrical impact, nor behave like avatars of national doctrine. They were simply soldiers performing a job. Even their music, drifting from radios in guard posts, startled her. Jazz tunes, swing rhythms, and American folk songs created an atmosphere that felt foreign, yet strangely alive. Many POWs later recalled the cultural shock of hearing lively music in a place they associated with dread. It was a reminder that the enemy lived in a different emotional landscape, one not defined by fear or constant sacrifice. The cultural contrast extended to gender. In Germany, women in uniform were expected to serve quietly, efficiently, and with strict discipline. Americans seemed surprised to see women as POWs at all, treating them more like civilians caught in war than military personnel. This unintended leniency was disarming. This clash between two worlds left her unsteady. It forced her to question the narratives she had internalized since childhood and prepared her for the moment when a simple American gesture would break those beliefs entirely. To understand her disbelief, we must also examine how the Americans viewed prisoners like her. For many US soldiers, young, tired, and thousands of miles from home, the German women they encountered seemed less like enemies and more like frightened civilians swept into a war they did not control. Female auxiliaries were not viewed as frontline fighters. They carried no weapons when captured. They posed limited physical threat. This perception shaped how guards interacted with them. American MPs were trained to maintain discipline but avoid unnecessary confrontation. Reports from POW camp commanders often emphasized the importance of restraint. Female prisoners, especially those clearly malnourished or emotionally fragile, were not to be treated harshly unless they posed a real danger. The war's moral weight, heavy with the knowledge of atrocities unfolding elsewhere, made mistreating any prisoner a potential stain on American conduct. Some guards, encountering German women who spoke broken English or none at all, defaulted to quiet gestures, pointing to food lines, showing where bunks were located, offering extra blankets when allowed. These moments were not emotional connections. They were part of a disciplined military approach to order and fairness. Yet for the prisoners, these gestures felt profound. A nod instead of a shout, a door held open, a guard returning a misplaced item rather than confiscating it. Small acts, but each one chipped away at the image of the Americans as merciless antagonists. The woman in our story observed these interactions closely. They did not erase the reality of captivity, but they created an environment where surprise became a daily companion, a build-up that made the pivotal moment ahead even more powerful. The deepest transformation came from within. Propaganda, once absolute, now collided with lived experience. In Germany, she had been taught that surrender was shameful and that the enemy viewed Germans as subhuman, but here she found a system that treated her according to rules, not rage. The psychological tension this created was immense. Many POWs described a strange internal struggle, relief at survival mixed with guilt, for feeling that relief, distrust battling with gratitude. The woman experienced this shift acutely. Each calm morning roll call, each undramatic meal distribution, each day without abuse, sharpened the contradiction. Moral dissonance emerged as she compared what she had feared with what she encountered, and this dissonance led to introspection she had never anticipated. If the enemy was not who she was told they were, then what else had been untrue? This was the angle that made the moment to come so meaningful. When the Americans gave her something she never expected, something small, perhaps, but profoundly human, it was not received in a vacuum. It landed in a heart already shaken, in a mind grappling with truth unraveling itself. The act became symbolic, echoing far beyond its physical value. It became the turning point. And to understand its full weight, we now follow her to the moment when everything she believed finally gave way. By the time she had spent several weeks inside the American POW camp, the German woman had grown accustomed to routines she once thought impossible. Yet even with these quiet surprises, a part of her still held back. Some fears linger for reasons that logic alone cannot erase. She followed orders. She kept to herself. She tried not to hope for anything beyond survival. But the moment that would stay with her for the rest of her life arrived on a gray morning in May 1945, after Germany had officially surrendered, though news traveled slowly through the fragmented world of prisoners. That morning began with a summons. A group of women, herself included, were instructed to report to the camp infirmary. She assumed the worst: a check for labor suitability, a reprimand, perhaps even reassignment to a harsher facility. The walk across the courtyard felt heavy, each step resonating with years of indoctrinated fear. Inside the small building, the air smelled of antiseptic, sharp, clean, and unfamiliar. A medic stood waiting with a clipboard. Another arranged supplies on a table. The women exchanged uneasy glances. None spoke. Then, the medic called her name. She stepped forward. What happened next would become the moment she couldn't believe what Americans gave her. The medic explained slowly, using simple English and gestures that she had been flagged during her earlier examinations. An infection, likely lingering for months, had worsened. It needed treatment, not punishment, not scolding. Treatment. He handed her a small metal cup with clean water and a set of tablets antibiotics. Actual antibiotics. Medicine so scarce in late-war Germany that even frontline soldiers often went without it. Hospitals had been bombed, supply chains shattered, pharmacies empty. Many had learned to accept untreated wounds as part of daily survival. Now, standing inside a building controlled by the enemy, she was being given something her own country could no longer provide. But that was not all. The medic reached into a drawer and produced a neatly wrapped parcel, a personal hygiene kit. Inside were items she had not seen since her early teenage years: a bar of scented soap, a small roll of bandages, a comb, antiseptic ointment, even a small packet of sanitary supplies. For women captured late in the war, these items were nearly unimaginable luxuries. Her hands froze. The realization hit her with stunning force. The Americans were giving her care. Not grudging assistance, not bare minimum survival. Genuine, structured, medical care, meant to heal her, not exploit her. They were giving her things meant for dignity, things meant for comfort, things meant for her well-being. In that instant, every warning she had ever heard about American cruelty collapsed. The propaganda that had shaped her childhood stories of torture, starvation, brutality, shattered under the weight of a small canvas parcel and a set of tablets. She could not hold her expression steady. Her throat tightened. She tried to speak, but her English was limited, and the emotion rising within her made language impossible. The medic simply nodded, misunderstanding her silence as fear, and motioned that she could return for more treatment the next day. But the moment did not end there. As she stepped outside, a guard noticed her trembling hands. Instead of ignoring her, he asked a simple gesture, a single word if she was all right. She nodded quickly, embarrassed, but the interaction added another layer to the revelation unfolding within her. This was the enemy she had been taught to fear, the enemy who now provided what her own country, even before its collapse, had not been able to give her. Over the following days, the antibiotics began to work. The fever that had quietly shadowed her for months faded. The pain receded. She slept without shivering. The hygiene kit allowed her to clean herself more thoroughly than she had in years. The improvement was visible, and other women also stunned by their treatment began to share similar experiences. Some received dental care, others got eyeglasses. Some were treated for malnutrition with vitamins and balanced meals. A few were even given replacements for shoes worn down to thread. But for her, it was the medical care, the simple act of being treated as a life worth preserving, that marked the turning point. It was the moment she realized that captivity under the Americans was not a sentence of suffering. It was, in a paradox she could barely comprehend, the first time in months she felt truly safe. And it was this moment that set the stage for a larger understanding, one that extended far beyond her own story and into the experiences of thousands of German women across the US POW system. To grasp the full impact, we must widen the lens and examine how this moment played out across countless camps and countless lives. Her moment in the infirmary was not an isolated episode. It was one of many small turning points experienced by German POW women across the American system as the war ended and the world shifted beneath their feet. To understand its full significance, we must look beyond her experience and explore how similar acts echoed across dozens of camps and thousands of prisoners throughout 1945. When Germany surrendered in early May, American forces suddenly found themselves responsible for vast numbers of POWs, including women from auxiliary units, clerical roles, medical detachments, and even anti-aircraft helpers. Some had surrendered voluntarily, others were swept up as their units collapsed. Regardless of how they arrived, a common thread soon emerged: disbelief at the treatment they received. Reports from U.S. POW camps described reactions that mirrored the woman's shock. American officers noted how many German prisoners seemed confused when offered medical attention. Some hesitated to accept food, assuming it would be withheld later or used as leverage. Others reacted emotionally when given blankets, clean clothing, or access to warm water. For many women, the most astonishing changes came in the realm of health. Years of bombing, shortages, malnutrition, and constant stress had taken a heavy toll on Germany's civilian and auxiliary populations. Dental decay, untreated infections, chronic wounds, and vitamin deficiencies were widespread. When American medics began treating these conditions, not just for survival, but with thorough care, POWs often expressed gratitude in ways that American personnel did not expect. There were accounts of women crying quietly during dental treatments not from pain, but from relief. Others wrote in diaries about the first solid meal they could eat without discomfort. And some, like the woman in our story, received antibiotics that were nearly impossible to obtain in Germany by late 1944. This widespread medical support was not motivated by sentiment. It was built into U.S. policy. The Geneva Convention required humane treatment, and America's logistical strength made compliance not just feasible, but efficient. Healthy prisoners were less likely to cause problems. They were more productive in labor assignments, and when repatriation began, they would return home with a perception of America shaped by their experience. The psychological impact of this treatment was profound. Many POWs, especially women, had spent years under a regime that demanded blind loyalty and fueled fear of the outside world. To encounter an enemy who provided comfort, structure, and medical help created a deep internal conflict. Their identities, shaped by ideology, now collided with lived reality. Letters captured in post-war archives reveal this emotional shift. Some women expressed astonishment at receiving food better than at home. Others wrote that they feared punishment for showing gratitude. A few admitted that the kindness felt like defeat because it challenged everything they believed about the enemy. For the American guards and medics, these reactions were unexpected. Many saw the prisoners as simply another responsibility in a war that demanded relentless discipline. They did not view their acts as extraordinary. They were following orders and maintaining a system. But for the women, these moments became markers in their personal histories, proof that the world was more complicated than the narratives they had been taught. The turning point extended beyond physical care. In some camps, women were given opportunities to work for small wages, learn English, or attend basic instructional classes. These tasks served practical purposes for the Americans, but offered prisoners a sense of stability, routine, and dignity. The contrast with the collapsing German home front, where hunger and fear dominated daily life, made captivity feel like a surreal, contradictory refuge. The woman at the center of our story was not alone in her disbelief. Many POW women would later describe their American captors not as benevolent, but as shockingly humane. That distinction mattered. The Americans did not treat them with affection or warmth. They treated them with order and fairness. And that fairness, after years of indoctrination and hardship, felt like an unexpected form of mercy. Her experience in the infirmary became a metaphor for the broader turning point all around her. The realization that survival, care, and dignity could come from a source she had been raised to fear. The antibiotics healed her body, but the implications of receiving them stayed with her far longer. They reopened questions she had never dared to ask about her world, her beliefs, and the war itself. But the story does not end in the moment of healing. Outside the camp fences, the world was changing rapidly. Germany lay in ruins. Millions were displaced. And soon, the Americans would begin the massive task of repatriating prisoners to homes that no longer resembled what they had left behind. What happened to these women psychologically, socially, and politically after captivity would shape their lives in ways as profound as anything that happened inside the camp. And this leads us to the consequences that followed the moment of disbelief, the aftermath of surrender, release, and return to a broken homeland. As the shock of surrender rippled across Europe in May 1945, the American POW camps shifted from wartime necessity to transitional gateways. The women inside them, including the one who had received care, so unexpectedly found themselves suspended between two worlds, the structured calm of captivity and the broken landscape waiting beyond the fences. The war had ended, but uncertainty had only begun. Repatriation did not happen overnight. The Allied forces faced the enormous challenge of processing millions of surrendered soldiers, displaced civilians, and forced laborers. Women, especially those who had served in auxiliary roles, were generally prioritized for earlier release. Their return, however, was far from simple. The German woman at the center of our narrative was informed that her repatriation would occur in phases. Before release, the camp implemented a standardized procedure: health checks, registration for transport, and documentation confirming she was no longer considered a combatant. These steps were more than administrative. They were the final reminders of an orderly system that had, in its unexpected way, protected her at a time when her homeland could not. When the day arrived, she received travel rations, bread, canned meat, a small bar of chocolate, and a modest parcel containing personal items allowed for the journey. The Americans did not wish prisoners to leave destitute or starving. A healthy returnee reduced the risk of disease spreading into already fragile regions. Some guards gave simple farewells. Others avoided eye contact, eager to move on. For her, these final interactions carried weight. They marked the end of a chapter defined by contradiction, captivity that had provided safety. The transport route brought her through towns that barely resembled the Germany she remembered. Buildings stood gutted, streets covered in debris, railway lines twisted by explosions. Families wandered in search of missing relatives. Children scavenged among ruins for anything edible or salvageable. The air smelled of dust and fires that had only recently gone out. This devastation struck her harder than any moment in the POW camp. She realized that, behind the fences, she had been insulated from a reality far harsher than captivity itself. When she reached her hometown, if it could still be called that, the emotional shock deepened. Familiar streets were gone, neighbors she had known since childhood had vanished or were too overwhelmed to speak. Her family home, like many, had been damaged beyond recognition. Those who remained alive were thin, weary, and carrying stories of fear that unfolded daily in the war's final months. In some communities, returning POWs were met with suspicion. Rumors circulated that anyone who had surrendered had been treated kindly only because they had cooperated with the enemy. These suspicions cut deeply, especially for women who had grappled with guilt and confusion during captivity. For the woman in our story, the silence surrounding her experiences became heavier than the memories themselves. How could she explain that her captors had shown her a form of humanity she did not expect? How could she articulate that within the camp she had felt safer than she did walking through the ruins of her own homeland? Others faced different challenges. Some women returned to find their families missing, displaced, or killed. Many struggled to secure food or housing. The German administration that emerged under Allied occupation began screening returning POWs to assess their wartime roles. Those with no direct involvement in war crimes were cleared quickly, but the process added yet another layer of scrutiny to lives already burdened by shame, trauma, and loss. Yet amid this hardship, the memory of the American camp lingered as a paradox, as a source of confusion, but also as a small light in a world that had otherwise descended into ruin. Her turning point in the infirmary became more than a moment of personal disbelief. It became a reference point for understanding the broader contrast between ideology and lived experience. And it was only the beginning of how captivity would shape her future. The years that followed would reveal just how deeply captivity had shaped the German woman's understanding of the world, and how profoundly it would influence the lives of others like her. For many former POW women, the return to civilian life was not a simple reintegration, but a long process of internal reconstruction, one in which the memories of American treatment played an unexpectedly central role. In post-war Germany, survival eclipsed everything. Cities struggled to feed their populations, infrastructure remained shattered, entire regions lacked electricity or clean water. Amid this bleakness, conversations about the war were muted, fragmented, or weighted with guilt. Former auxiliaries like her often found themselves in a delicate position. They were not celebrated as veterans, yet they were scrutinized for their participation in the wartime system. Their experiences as POWs were considered irrelevant compared to the suffering of civilians who had endured relentless bombing or the horrors emerging from the concentration camps. But despite the silence that surrounded them, many women carried private memories that conflicted with the prevailing narrative. They remembered the Americans who had maintained order without cruelty. They remembered the doctors who treated them with professionalism rather than contempt. They remembered the unexpected decency that surfaced in moments when they were most vulnerable. These memories did not erase their loyalty to their homeland, but they complicated their understanding of friend and enemy in ways they could not easily articulate. For the woman in our story, the small hygiene kit and the course of antibiotics became symbols of a broader truth she had discovered, that humanity could appear in the most unlikely places, and that kindness, when given without agenda, had the power to reshape beliefs far more deeply than force ever could. In the years after the war, she rarely spoke of this moment openly. Such stories did not fit neatly into post-war discourse, and many feared being misunderstood or accused of misplaced gratitude. But privately, she held on to the memory as proof that the world was wider and more nuanced than she had been taught. Some former POW women eventually shared their experiences through memoirs or interviews conducted decades later. Their recollections echoed similar themes: disbelief at American generosity, confusion at the contrast between propaganda and reality, and an enduring gratitude for small acts that restored their sense of dignity. Historians later noted that these testimonies helped illuminate the broader humanitarian dimension of the Allied POW system, an aspect often overshadowed by the larger strategic narrative of the war. Yet not all consequences were emotional or introspective. The immediate physical effects of American medical care left lasting impacts. Women who received treatment for infections or malnutrition often avoided long-term health complications that could have shaped the rest of their lives. Some survived because they were given antibiotics at a moment when such medicine was nearly impossible to obtain in Germany. Others regained enough strength to rebuild their families, pursue education, or adapt to the profoundly altered society emerging under Allied occupation. As Germany divided into East and West, stories of American POW camps took on different political meanings. In the West, they contributed quietly to a growing perception of the United States as a stabilizing force. In the East, such accounts were often suppressed or discouraged, replaced by narratives that emphasized Western aggression. The woman's personal story, preserved only in her memory and perhaps shared with a few trusted confidants, became part of this complex mosaic of post-war identity formation. Decades later, as Europe rebuilt and new generations grew up free from the shadows of war, the significance of that moment in the American infirmary remained unchanged for her. It was the instant when fear gave way to recognition that the enemy could also be human, that compassion could appear amid destruction, and that war, for all its darkness, could still contain unexpected acts of light. Her experience was not unique, but it was deeply personal, and like thousands of others, she carried it quietly into the rest of her life. These lingering impressions, the shock, the gratitude, the moral reckoning, form the foundation for a final reflection on what her story reveals about humanity and warfare. Her story, like so many others woven into the vast fabric of the Second World War, reminds us that history is not shaped solely by battles, strategies, or political decisions. It is shaped just as powerfully by quiet human moments, moments that unfold far from the front lines, witnessed only by those who carry them for the rest of their lives. For the German POW woman, the war had been a world of absolutes. She had been told what to believe, who to fear, and how to interpret the conflict that consumed her nation. In that world, the enemy was a faceless threat, defined by ideology rather than experience. Yet in captivity, those absolutes dissolved. A bar of soap, a clean blanket, a cup of water, and a set of antibiotics. These simple items became symbols of a truth that propaganda could not suppress, that humanity endures even in the most violent of times. Her disbelief was not rooted in weakness, it was rooted in the collapse of certainty. When the Americans treated her infection, they treated more than a wound. They disrupted a lifetime of conditioning. They revealed that dignity could survive in places she expected only cruelty, that compassion could emerge from those she was taught to despise, and that war, for all its devastation, could not entirely extinguish the instinct to protect rather than destroy. In the years that followed, she rarely spoke of that moment, yet it remained with her, a quiet memory that outlasted the ruins of cities and the shifting borders of nations. It became a reminder that moral clarity is rarely found in slogans or speeches, but in the actions individuals choose to take when no one is watching. Her experience does not rewrite the brutal realities of the Second World War. It does not minimize the suffering endured by millions or the atrocities committed across continents, but it does reveal something essential: that even in an age defined by destruction, acts of decency still mattered. They mattered to the people who received them. They mattered to the world they eventually helped rebuild. And in that fragile space between fear and compassion, between captivity and care, her disbelief became a quiet testament to the enduring power of humanity in the darkest of times.